Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll have to say that in English because unfortunately I never really had a chance to learn and master modern Turkish. I pretend that I know Ottoman Turkish, but anyway, others have to judge that. I have before me questions that I am supposed to try to answer. Shall I read the questions?
Yes, you're up to you.
Okay. The first question says, let's begin with your early years in Jerusalem before going to the United States. What was your education and childhood environment? I will start, I think as a historian, it's important to situate me by date of birth, and that actually then situates me by generation. At what age I am now, I'm 84. I was born in 1933 to, I would say, a lower middle class family in Jerusalem. I was born in the old city in an extended family. And extended family, I think all of you understand, means several children living together with, in our case, only my maternal grandfather. My paternal grandfather died in World War I as an Ottoman soldier. Anyway, we moved out of the old city when I was about 4 or 5, and we moved in outside the walled city, basically. My earliest education started in preschool for 1 year, then to a private Arab, in that case Arab Muslim school for 2 years, and then my third year of schooling started in a missionary English school.
What was the curriculum in private school there first? What was the curriculum like?
Well, you're asking me to remember, right?
Okay.
And I don't know if any of you can remember when you were 5 years old.
If you
I have to say that the only thing I remember, and vividly, is when I started the missionary school in the third year, and now as I reflect in retirement as to what were, and remember, I think we remember the emotionally significant issues after 50, 70, 80 years. And emotional, I guess, because we retain resonances of it unconsciously, but then later on we recall and they come back to us. I had a school teacher, somebody, I guess I estimate being in her 50s or 60s. I still remember her name. We called her Mrs. Hanoush, but she was an Arab Christian teacher, and I still remember her teaching about the pyramids. And I attribute really my interest in history, the beginning of my interest in history, to that teacher. That's in third grade. As I said, I remember her name. I actually have her face right in front of me. So I went on, the school that I went to allowed us to study other subjects than English in Arabic language, math and so on and so forth in Arabic. Then from 5th or 6th grade, all subjects were taught in English. We had to change from Arabic into English, and we were also encouraged to speak in English outside of the classroom. So again, there was a very, as I look back at it, of course, I didn't understand it then. It was systematic way of orienting us to communicate in English rather than in Arabic. And so from then on, all of the subjects, academic subjects that we studied, were in English. And I didn't stay very long in the English school system because by 47, 48, the interruption of what was British mandated Palestine to partially the creation of Israel. My family was well enough off. We didn't become refugees, so we went into exile to Egypt in luxury, actually. We didn't suffer. I don't consider myself as having experienced a refugee experience. I stayed in Egypt for a year, and again there I went to an Irish but English-speaking missionary school. This time it was Catholic.
Egypt.
In Cairo, outside Cairo, called Heliopolis.
Heliopolis.
You know
Yeah, I
that,
know
right?
that.
It's Misr al-Jadida.
Misr
right?
al-Jadida,
Yeah. So we stayed a year, and then we went back, and whatever remained of Palestine, luckily for us, the home we had. Yeah.
In which school yesterday you said the principal was surprised that you didn't convert to Christianity?
Yeah, that's college.
College you are speaking. I see, okay.
So, when I returned, the school in Jerusalem, the English school, continued. Of course, the British are not in control, and they, of course, had to modify the curriculum because the Jordanians had taken over that part. And the school had actually stopped servicing, accepting students beyond the 7th grade, which is the ending of the elementary school. So the secondary schools was closed. So in my case, I ended up going to Ramallah, which is about 20 minutes ride from Jerusalem north, to a Quaker American Friends School. There was a boys' school and there was a girls' school as well. In that school, unlike the system in Jerusalem, there was more emphasis on Arabic and Arabic use. But the only difference is that there were courses in Arab history and taught by Arab historians and in Arabic as well. So I graduated from the Friends Boys School in 52. One of the visiting teachers in my third year at the Friends School had come for a year. Most of the foreign teachers at that school, there were about 3 or 4, came for 1 year. And his father had gone to a college in Virginia. He stopped there, recommended me, and they had a program of accepting foreign students with full fellowship for 1 year. And that's how I really ended up at a college in Virginia, in the South, called Lexington. The town is Lexington, Virginia. And the name of the university was Washington and Lee University. So it celebrates the founder and as well as the commander of the Southern forces in the Civil War in the United States. So it was a very Southern school, very conservative, of course, full segregation, of which I was totally unaware. There was just the African Americans, they're not called Africans, they're called Negroes. At the time, were mainly the support service, the services. When I went in, I thought I will do psychology, just to retrace. Before I left Jerusalem, I turned to my father and said, "What should I major in?" You know, again, like a good, beautiful son. He said, "Don't major in what your brother had majored in. My brother's older, he had majored in economics. So the field was open to me and to my friends. So when I ended up at the college, as I said, I started doing psychology. The professor was very boring, and he was doing the kind of psychology I wasn't interested in. By my sophomore year, I decided to try history. And the only histories that were taught were American history and European. So I specialized mainly in European history. And there was a very sympathetic philosophy professor, European philosophy, and I took courses with him. So my training was really more in European history, European culture. One of the most wonderful experiences I had at Washington D. is that the dean of the university was somebody, a famous anthropologist who had left Yale to become dean at Washington D. And he was a very ambidextrous, very multi-talented in all kinds of literature, especially ancient literature. And so he taught, of course, ancient history, he taught Greek and Roman literature. He also had Bible classes outside at one of the churches. And so I took his courses, and he sort of looked after me. He was a bachelor and lived on campus. So basically, that's what I continued my program in history. And I really had a mediocre beginning because I was really adjusting to. None of us had gone to college before. My brother had, but I didn't have this experience. So, at least in my style and my personality, I had to learn how to adjust to a disciplined education. My mother finished 6th grade, my father 3rd grade. So I didn't have any models, that I could follow abstractly. And so, anyway, so I the first 2 years, my performance was adequate, C, and most of my grades in history were A. So I was doing well in history, but I was indifferent in the other courses. By the 3rd and 4th year, I took off, and I mostly got A's in practically everything, which then both encouraged me and allowed me to think that I want to go to graduate school. And at the time, I was entertaining going to graduate school in the United States. Most of the elite universities did not require an exam, an entrance exam. There was no public exam. So in other words, you're not competing with the whole country and filtering through as to whether or not you are going to be accepted at a particular school. Anyway, so the means of assessing by universities of incoming students was basically personal recommendations from the professors who taught you. In other words, in a way, all of us who are educators know, we really know our students better than any system that can actually do it. So anyway, so it's because of the last 2 years of doing quite good in college, 3 professors recommended me, and I applied only to Princeton and Harvard. I said, these are the only 2 places I want to go. And these were the only places at that time, I think Princeton mainly, provided Middle Eastern history. At that time, it wasn't called Middle Eastern or Near Eastern, it was called Oriental Studies, which tells you about the orientation of Orientalism and so on. So I was recommended and admitted, and with full fellowship, which lasted for 6 years and allowed me to do a PhD. I applied. I got accepted in both Harvard and Princeton, and 2 of my advisors at Washington Lee thought Princeton was more my style. I would enjoy it more. So I went there, and they gave me, as I said, full fellowships, meaning tuition, board, and upkeep. The only thing I needed to provide was pocket money, on a daily basis, whatever I needed. So I went in, and then I had the choice, right? I'm there. I want to do history. At that time, there was a special program that the history department and Oriental Studies had put together that was what was really called European and Middle Eastern history. And the curriculum consisted of modern Russian history, that is 16th century Russia to the present, European history, again, from the early modern period to the present, and Near Eastern history. And of course, I came under the rubric of and aegis of Oriental Studies. So my primary purpose in going to Princeton was to do something in the Middle East. Remember, I didn't do any other work in the academy after my 3rd grade, anything to do with Arab history, Muslim history, or what have you, history of the Middle East. So I looked at choices. At that time, the Oriental Studies department was combined the Orient, including China. Japan was added later, but it was really mainly China that was, and the Near East, that is, Ottoman, Turkish, Arab, and Iranian, Persian I should say, anyway, Iranian. And I decided I am Arab, and I'm really acculturated as an Arab. I knew Arabic. What are they going to teach me about Arab history? That was my thinking. And what was available was Turkish, and Iranian. Persian wasn't appealing. So I decided, well, I'll try Turkish history. I mean, really not Turkish history. I wanted to do the earlier part. I was more interested in the history than the modern politics. And that basically, my training as a student was in 3 areas: Russian, European, and Near Eastern, with focus both on Persian, Iranian, and Turkish Ottoman studies, and I continued. And at the time, you have to imagine I'm really politically tabula rasa. I don't have any programs. I don't have any tendencies, political or otherwise. So I came in completely naive into it, and so I did really focus then on Turkish, and I took my exams in the 3 areas, and did very well and excellent in Ottoman language, because my exam was in Naima, incidentally, in text in the eski harflar, and my professor was a specialist on Naima. His book came out, his name is L.B. Thomas. And surprisingly enough, I did very well, I passed, and he said, I still remember, he said, what is interesting is the hard parts in your translation were perfect. You were able to do the hard parts. It's only the less hard parts that you were marginal. I didn't care. The important thing is I passed. And this became my primary language of research. Being acculturated as an Arab, raised in Arabic, that, as you all know, is a great advantage for anybody who's doing Ottoman history. Not only in terms of the language is a different language than Arabic or Persian, but in terms of script. So all of you probably started in your education about Ottoman by reading it through Yeni Harflar. Whereas for me, I went straight into, because I was more comfortable with the Arabic script, the Escalfar. So that was an advantage which I had over Europeans and Americans and so on.
We can come back to graduate part level, but for your undergraduate, maybe even high school level to upward, I don't know the question was, but I was just thinking to ask you about, that was your institutional attachment studies and all these things, but your daily life as a student, as your friend in a places where in a high school, in a graduate school, or in a university.
I think I think you're asking a very fundamental question, which I think is crucial in terms of my outlook. When I went to school in Palestine before '48, the English school I attended drew on all languages and nationalities. In other words, Greek Arabs who were inhabitants of Palestine, who are products again of the Ottoman experience, Jewish students, because after all it was Palestine, and so there were Jewish students, Arab, Muslim, Christian. I would say the majority of the students were Arab Muslims, but there were Jewish students from Europe, Jewish students from locality, immigrants after all in the 40s, children of immigrants from Europe who came to Palestine. And so I really grew up in a multicultural environment in that sense. So none of these were aliens to me. They were my contemporaries. And I would say a good number of them probably tried to learn Arabic to communicate. But English, after all, was the common language we had, so we were able to communicate. So I think it's a very important question you're asking. And here this, for the first time I think about it, and I'm sharing with you. I think it may have given me a more tolerant, accepting view of others. All right. This is my interpretation of the question you're asking. Yeah. Okay.
Did you find yourself, let's say, in a movement that maybe considered rebellious, maybe considered something that's even when you were in universities in America, did you find yourself against these systems that you are studying? Because you had, after all, end up studying.
If I were to attribute anything close to what you're saying, I think that in a way, I would say that my real rebellious experience was after my PhD.
I see. Okay.
And really, it was a rebellion against my education. Okay. The orientation to Middle Eastern history, especially in this case, because the orientation was primarily modernization. Middle Eastern societies are backward and had to be. Yeah.
Did you have any connection with Edward Said? Any connection with Edward Said?
Edward Said was younger than I, and he was. I think he was an undergraduate.
So you were an RB for Edward Said?
No, I was an undergraduate. He was an undergraduate at Princeton when I was a graduate student, and he was also in the primary school when I started the secondary school in English school. Yeah.
In Cairo?
In Jerusalem.
In
Jerusalem. No, I didn't meet him. I didn't know about him till we came here, and we met at Princeton briefly. And at that time, he wasn't famous in the sense of Orientalism.
You said you find yourself more critical, more, let's say, rebellious at the time after graduate studies.
Yes.
I mean,
if I had any meaning for rebelliousness,
okay. I mean, I'm using it as a metaphor.
And I'm responding to it because it's the significant part of rebellion. In other words, you can rebel by saying, your mother and father say do this, and you say you do it, and in secret you don't, and so on. But in terms of significance, I really did not feel that. As I answered you, I really think that I first rebelled after graduate school because the kind of orientation about Middle Eastern studies, and it's ironic because the professor who taught Ottoman history, by focusing on Naima, would give you the impression that he's looking at Naima as an example that would be evidence to the contrary of decline. Okay? Naima, yeah. So that was, and incidentally, even though they focused on Naima, he didn't publish his work on Naima. So whatever tendencies he had in trying to understand this period, where this was his dissertation actually, which he did in Belgium. I would say to me it looked typical. It became to look typical with a lot of people who start in research and thinking and commitment, tentative commitment in certain directions. And the way I'm interpreting here, in retrospect, I couldn't feel it at the time. The people who began to see alternatives to the decline paradigm, the modernization paradigm. And I think L.B. Thomas was one of those people, and Norman Iskevitz following him, too, did the same. But what is fascinating to me, and now I'm 84, I can really interpret. I have the right and the freedom to interpret what they did. Now, the way I see it, they really started a very constructive course, program. And they expressed it by Iskevitz did by a couple of articles, challenging the Orientalist historiography about the Middle Period, and in a way, starting what looks like a research program to try to look at this period as something that can be explored. And the amazing thing is that neither one of them pursued that. And they did other things. Thomas, my major advisor, really did not publish much. He became a full professor there and so on. And Iskevitz did the same thing, and I think Iskevitz was Engin's contemporary at Princeton, Wilming, right? Yeah. Did other things than the Middle Period. And even if both of them were here, and I could interrogate why did they not pursue? And incidentally, they're very constructive. The kinds of insights they had were very constructive. They're not distorted. So it seems as if, I'm going to make it dramatic, it's as if they saw the truth and were afraid to see it, to do it, to continue. Of course, there are more sinister ways of looking at it, but I would say at a minimum, they decided that if they go that way, they're not going to feel welcome in the academy. This is my best core scenario, is the positive one. They basically wanted to identify with the larger culture. And that's their choice, it's their culture. Had they followed what they have started and pursued, they probably would have found themselves isolated. Again, this is guessing because I can't.
But their student didn't.
Well, who are the students? Yeah. And the question, they have to ask again, why and who are the students you're talking about?
Let's say that's the question. Why their student you?
Why did what?
Why you didn't go the same way? You wanted the other way.
Remember when I was describing how my graduate education started, and basically I didn't have any point of view, any paradigms. So I'm being a good student. I accepted what I was being taught, and even did a dissertation that can be anything. I did a dissertation on the Treaty of Karlowitz and diplomatic history, which does not really probe into the social history of the Ottoman Empire in this period. It's afterwards that I have to think. I was intellectually pretty unhappy with it, so I experimented. I said, and as I look back at it, I decided I'm going to learn different approaches and the modernization. And I was a visitor in Southern California where I taught from Germany, a woman in psychology who was an expert on Marx, and she did a reading group on Marx. We did a reading group on Marx, and we read Marx. We spent.
That's in California.
What?
That's in California?
In California,
yes.
Southern California. And so it was an informal group. It was not anything having to do with any...
Is that the first time you find yourself engaged in Marxist...
Yeah, and among others, because I was also engaged in exploring Freud, and I was interested...
Why not in Princeton? Like in your graduate studies, the Marx is one of the...
None of them oriented. There was no orientation towards
not in Princeton.
Marx. No, not contemporary with mine. I don't know, again, if there was anything that you remember from your experience.
So California was blessings for you.
And this was independent of any
sense,
university.
It was a blessings for you?
What?
In a sense, it was a blessings for you to conceptually find yourself where you are.
I don't know if you call it a blessing, but it's a way out of having to do modernization. And I experimented with psychology, Freud. I read most of Freud's works, and I attended seminars by... Yeah.
When I say blessings, I mean in the sense that you were not happy with what you were seeing these, orientations in the Princeton. In California, you went out of that type of orientation, and then you find there also places where you can study conceptually about that. That's what I mean from the.
I mean, and the way I would say it, I wouldn't put it in those terms. I said that I was unhappy intellectually, okay?
Right.
And so I'm exploring, and basically that was one of the available avenues. And so my wife and I actually enrolled in that informal group, and I formed other reading groups with other scholars, trying to critically evaluate the scholarship that was being produced about Middle Eastern history. Don Carter was one of the people, when he was a graduate student, involved me, was with a couple of reading groups like that.
When the Mukherjee came in?
Ramakrishna Mukherjee taught for 6 weeks at Binghamton in the 90s. Okay, this is after this was not in Southern California.
I see.
So my exposure to Mukherjee was basically after I retired from California.
California, okay.
So in the mid-90s, 1990s. Yeah. And it was, you know, I mean, it was not influenced me in any way.
I'm just saying
Right,
as
yeah,
like a network, as a thing, you know.
Mhm.
Would we take questions from also from that? Now, in your graduate studies or undergraduate studies, do you remember anything that was not academically, but socially important to you, in terms of the, you know, the, let's say, youth or students? They were very in 60s, 50s, and 60s is one of the most highlighted, most debated time, right, in academia, student movements and all these things around. And what would be your reflections on looking back at that? And you are a student at those time period. This is one of the most...
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a valid question, and I think you're probing something I didn't experience. I mean, I did not experience rejection. I mean, somebody from the Middle East, was Arab. I basically felt as a undergraduate accepted as a fellow student. So there was no prejudice towards me.
Okay.
In that sense. So I can't say I was a subject. I mean, I said that, I mean, I think that perhaps, interestingly, what I experienced the most alienation is postgraduate, after, when I became a professor and began to ask questions in public forums at universities and conferences. And it's funny because I never saw a pattern, and that has to be explained. You can have your own thoughts of it, and I can share with you my own thoughts. The first time I remember in 1958, it was the end of my second year in graduate school. I was at Harvard doing Persian. I took Persian as a language. Again, as all of you know who do Ottoman, the Persian, of course, is the third language in the formation of Ottoman culture. So I was taking it. And the founder of the Middle East Center at Harvard, his name was H.R.A.R. Gibb. He became Sir. And again, a graduate student attending a seminar, a lecture he gave. And I have to tell you, it's very unorthodox what I'm doing. I don't remember the questions I asked. I don't remember the reactions. I don't remember, I don't remember the question I don't remember the lecture. In other words, even the occasion. What I do remember is the rejection that I received and felt to the question I asked. And I remember, I am telling you, I don't remember the question. I only remember the rejection, the feeling that they didn't want me there. It's as if I was disturbing something. And interesting, as it's 58, I was still a graduate student, and it continued. It continued into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, actually till my retirement. Wherever I went to forums in the United States or in Europe, I had questions, and the questions were not meant as hostile. I mean, I was naive enough to not know I was being hostile if this is how they interpret. Now, my feeling is, I'm asking you a question, and instead of getting an answer, I got dismissal. The way in one instance, my sister was a historian, and I attended a seminar given by Roger Owen, who does Middle Eastern economic history, and he gave a lecture, and my sister and I asked questions, and he didn't answer our questions. But afterwards, he said, Samira and her brother attacked me. So instead of answering the questions, so now I am thinking, what's going on? I'm trying to understand. And the way I interpret this, and there's a lot of wishful thinking on my part. Here's basically from the way I see myself. I was very optimistic, and here I come to a lecture and to a forum, and we are all equals, right? And scholars. I was a professor at one point, and even as a professor, when I asked the questions, instead of answering the intellectual content of my question, there was always an emotional reaction, like rejection. And there was a graduate student from Harvard who was in Middle Eastern Studies, who is now a famous person in Oxford, an American. And I guess at the time, maybe about 50 or 60 years old. We were at a meeting together, and we discussed something at the end of a session. And he turned to me, he said, I don't want to insult you, and he walked away. And so these are the kinds of receptions I had for the question. So I'm still naively thinking, I'm being honest, I'm asking questions. And to me, it's very significant. I'm just thinking, where did these questions come from? And without much further ado, I would say, I'm thinking, these questions did not come from my formal education. My formal education, remember, was mainly in English, oriented towards English society in America, the same thing, European history, and so on. My secondary school education, my college, my graduate education, none of it, actually. In none of it I felt that it was consciously hostile to me. It's only, as I said, in '58 that I raised a question, and then consistently I kept that. So where did these questions come from? It didn't come, as I said, from my education, because my education would have favored all the paradigms, the approaches that I was experiencing in the West. And it may be bizarre for you, but I feel that my orientation, where these questions came from, is my understanding, first of all, my acculturation in my own society and my own culture. And I really attribute it to the earliest stages of my upbringing. I'm old enough to be bold to tell you something that some of you might think is foolish. I think my orientation towards life, and I think the source of my ability to ask questions, is the way I was raised. And I basically attribute it to my mother. Okay? That's my view of life, basically positive. I went through all that education looking at it as a positive experience. Okay? Offend
I have two questions, Rifa'at Ali. One of them is about your graduate student days. Who were some of your classmates from your years at Princeton? How did you get along with them in terms of the preparing the field for the future, because many of them, including you, became future teachers of younger scholars. So that's one question. And at that time, of course, some of your at Princeton Arab studies was, in a sense, more important under Philip Gitti than even Kenny's documents when they came. There still it was more like Arab history. Why didn't you feel attracted in that direction? But I have also something to remind everybody here, that while you're asking those questions in many meetings, some people feel that you have agonized them or attacked them, but at the same time, those very questions attract younger students, and to you, they gather around you. Many of them put this festive for you. They're all, in certain ways, younger scholars to have come under your influence. So, did you reflect on that? What's the difference between, say, Roger Owen and Baki Tezcan, for instance? Why? What's the difference between them? And doesn't this change the way we study the Middle East, from Roger Owen to Baki Tezcan or Eugene Rogan, for instance? Three questions in one.
Fantastic. You know, it's a profound question you're asking. But from my experience, we're talking about graduate students now, because undergraduates, it's a different story. And what is our commitment to pedagogy? Why do we teach? What is our goal as an undergraduate? You're asking me about graduate school, right? Because I'll be very happy to talk about also my views about pedagogy and how I viewed my teaching in America. And I was basically teaching American students about history, European history. I taught American history a little, but basically I was teaching history for American students for their own understanding of history in general and also their own. But I think you're putting your finger on a historical time where I find the picture not that simple. Let me start just with a very bold statement. I find American students who do Middle Eastern history, and of course I didn't know any abstraction, so the only other students with a different background were Turkish students who came to Binghamton. And I wasn't their principal advisor. At Princeton, you know, some of them, I was there for 1 year, and Engin Bey is referring to one of the students, a Turkish student by Baki Tezcan, right? You're talking about, yeah. And there, I think Baki was the only Turkish student at Princeton. No, there was one person, but anyway, the generalization I'm going to make is that the reception to my way of thinking, that I assumed, without my consciously saying so, the reception, I won't call it a reception, it was normal. The Turkish graduate students I had, I didn't have to convince them of anything. My contact with them, and I didn't know any of them personally, so it has nothing to do with biography or familiarity even with Turkish students as such. And I think it's a significant thing for us to think of, because I think it has future different ramifications beyond education and actually our view of history and the future. This is the way, again, at my age I can, and with retirement, I can be bold to say I have this vision and this is the way it should go, it could go. So it's the first point. The fourth point is that the graduate students I had of American, European background, and the difference between all the Turkish graduate students I had. I did not feel any discomfort. I did not feel any, how do I say, rejection in what I was doing in terms of teaching. No one said, "Who are you to teach me this?" And I think, when I was younger and thinking, there used to be a joke about Turks turning to Arabs, and who are the Arabs? They are this and that. And somebody says, and who you're, just because you have a PhD and you're still an Arab, how can you teach me anything, right? And so, anyway, I never experienced any of that. Every one of the graduate students, and I can't claim that they are my students. They are students I had. I was not their primary advisor. There are people who took courses with me. They all might say they are my students, but formally, as far as universities are concerned, I maybe was on the head of 2 or 3 graduate students who were Turkish. And all of that was accidental because Don Carter died, and so I basically inherited. And all of them were in areas that I have no expertise. So they all worked in the modern period. So it's in terms of that direct kind of intellectual coincidence and understanding, it didn't come from working on the 17th, 18th century, because nobody worked on the 17th, 18th century, including most of Turkish students. I mean, Yunus can testify to that. And Yunus was one person who came visiting to really take my classes and get deeper view of a critique of my work. So, and anyway, so it's a question of receptivity. So that ultimately, this is what I began to feel. There's a question of cultural receptivity. There was no resistance from any of the Turkish students about my teaching, about the concept I used. It was just assumed we were at home, right? We were just having, Qasim, I think, is one of them. We're in the same culture, we're talking. And it is true. I mean, as I begin to think, and I begin to discover, basically, that my cultural orientation, which goes back to the early years of my life, I don't think differs then with your cultural experience. That's my theory, anyway. And that is the reception. And that when I was hiding, and now I can see it, behind objectivity, and I wrote it basically in my last book, I thought of myself as a historian. And in second or third paragraph in the preface of my last third book, I say if history is a science, then Ottoman history has to be taught like any other history. In other words, it's equally valid. to this day, most of the people who teach Ottoman history, who are not from the Middle East, are crippled in not being able to accept the equality. And the assumption I keep really coming back to, assumptions two. When I look at Ottoman history, I don't look at it as an alien history. And also, I think I saw it basically and did it and felt I was doing a history of a living society. And that is a very important issue. Living in the sense that when I looked at that history, 17th, 18th century, I didn't see a crippling pattern. I saw chaos, all right, which is what history of continuous society is. And we as historians select from that history. And so those of us who are fortunate enough to believe that if you want to do history, you have to know the primary sources. In other words, you have to know the contemporary sources of the period you're working. To be for me to be credible, at least you're giving us a demonstration saying, I look at that chaos in the 17th century, and this is what the order I find, the interpretation. And basically when I look at the research program I followed, and everybody says I'm an Ottoman historian, my specialty is really about 35 years of Ottoman history. And it's not really very deep. Late 17th, early part of the 18th century. And the way I started was, okay, I mean, I have a different approach and thinking. And this is not very conscious. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how do you go about doing a different kind of history, okay? So I decided what I will do is try to give a concrete reality, biographical, to the viziers and pashas who were challenging the sultans. I mean, challenging is actually a misinterpretation because, in fact, the viziers and pashas were already running the state. It's not a state, it's a formation, it's a group, it's a clique, it's a gang. You know? But I found it's a real gang of maybe 200 people. So I built a biography of this group, and I published my first work on it, an article, the Vizier and Pasha House. So incidentally, Halil Inalcık rejected that article, wouldn't recommend it to be published. But that's a different story. I have a different story about Halil Inalcık, but if you want me, I can talk about it later.
We want you to speak.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You want me to talk about it now or?
Later on,
okay.
just finish this one. And, yesterday also it came up with your graduate students, and that was a case. Now let me repeat the things just to put it in the context. When Nader told you that him and me together, we took the critique of Leslie Pierce of your study. We were serious there. Mm-hmm. We were taking that critique because the idea that, taking the previous years as a historical period as a standard, not dynamic, freeze it, stand from there, go further on, that was your critical of that one, and she was criticizing that, well, you have these other things that you take freezing too from that. So we had struggled with that concept, that taking a dip from history as a freeze, but then whatever you study, you end up being, in a certain level, as a strategy, you say, freezing it, and we were struggling with that one. But we didn't come up with as this is Leslie Pierce's critique of you. We presented to you as our critique in the graduate seminar there. And you quote us. You quote us. You said you are hiding behind the Leslie Pierce, right? That's what you told us, and
yeah.
Nadir
That's your
highlighted
memory,
up.
but go ahead.
Right,
Yeah.
that's a memory. Now I will bring it to the different level. Now, when we speak in any discourse, in any language, academic language, we are, as a student, we are taking those concepts. In this case, Leslie Pierce. Just forget about that. We are taking the concept from it's formulated. It is produced and reproduced in academic circles. We are learning those and speaking with those concepts. Some fitting our own way of understanding, some doesn't fit, whatever it is. At that point, you were very angry. So in your relations with your students, but how I would put it, I don't want to say like, did you see yourself like as a father is educating and disciplining the children? Or, I mean, we are trying to understand that moment of your anger. It's not only that case. Let me repeat two more things. And I said to you one time that, well, I'm studying with Donald Quartert, and you told me with an angry face a little bit, do you think that you will get what you want to get for your own study's sake? And I was just like, I remember that moment still. Another point, and I was studying with Wallerstein about structures of the knowledge and that circle, in a Gulbenkian circle. I continued there 1 year to study with him. And when you heard about that, I was trying to hide this from you, of course. When you heard about this, you was not happy with that too. This also, of course, it is. We are also interacting with you, with others, with everything. And as Imam, I'm interacting with the other whole framework. In what I mean there. So this is a experience. We got sometimes you getting angry on us. Sometimes we were so attached to you, definitely. We loved you. We would come and study with you, and you know how long we had those discourses and discussions. From things that attached me to you one time, you wrote in your board. It was my first attachment there too. It says, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. That was, you had it there. When I came to your office, I didn't know what's there. So I asked you, what is this? This is from hadith and ayats and all together. And then you told me that how the historical processes creates the meaning for this khuluq and azim and those things. We had a whole long conversations there. So there are a lot of things that would attract us to you, but at the same time you were angry with us. We'll still come back to you. What you would say of that. And then this is not like a matter. No. Yesterday, Nadir also highlighted that part. Yeah. So just put it in this context, and then, and your graduate students, that was a question. What you would say about that?
I'm going to try just to change the discourse. Try to answer you in a completely different way from what you're presenting.
You always did.
Okay. If we were to engage in the battle that you set up and you say, I was doing this, it'll be your word against mine, and I would rather try to approach this from a different angle. Two of my books were published in Turkish, translated and published. I never ever thought of the possibility of their translation into Turkish. Actually, neither of the Turks who approached me to ask me, would you allow us to publish your book in Turkish? Then, not my students. Basically, I met one of them at a conference, and I met them in Turkey, and so there were actually people I met at conferences. So I'm going to talk about answering you and Engin Bey also in terms of perception. I have, as I said, I'm just reiterate, I had nothing to do with any of the publication of my work in Turkish. the initiative, and I think the significant part is it didn't come from me, but it came from Turkish scholars and graduate students. And I want you to think the initiative for that is not from me. I don't have a sense. First of all, I really can't claim I have even a modicum of control over scholarly production by Turks, modern Turks, even 20 years ago, 30 years, or now even. In terms of the paradigms that you are trained in and are exposed to. So, I want you to think, how would you explain why, if I was not taking the initiative, I really have no sense of where intellectually Turkish historians are in terms of the interpretation of Turkish history. Ottoman history, basically. Not Turkish history, Ottoman history. So, and again, I'm thinking about how is knowledge produced, the modern sense of knowledge. If you think it's history is a science, the interpretation changed, and the question is how and why do the interpretation change, and then how do you explain receptivity? How do you, for example, as I said in Aljuk, did not recommend the publication of my article on the Wazir and Pasha household. So they didn't, his generation was not receptive to this kind of thinking. Somehow, both in terms of contact with other scholars, some Turkish scholars at conferences, and it's not something I intended, they were there, they listened, and they actually found resonances, meaning to it. So I say, one, the reception is more important than my creation, because the reception is what we aim at. We hope that what we publish, what we work, what we think through, will find a reception. And as I said, I asked God, I had nothing to do with exposing those of you who began to know me in English, if you don't read it, to my interpretation of Ottoman history. So I think it's for you to interpret. Why is it that over the last 10 years, my work is being received? It's not because it is profound, because there are other profound thinkers. So there's something that resonates for those of you who are working. And we're not talking about the truth, we're talking about really contending with the various paradigms and issues you think about. Again, all I can talk about is a 30 or 40 year period of time. So I really would like to ask those of you who are Ottoman historians to try to explain to me why would all of a sudden, about 20 years ago, my work started in the 70s, and my last serious publication was in the 1990s, 91, 92. Efendim.
That connects to something as regarding the general theme that we are also discussing here. When you were a graduate student at Princeton, and for that matter, when I was a graduate student at Princeton, the connections between the Near Eastern Eastern studies and history, or for that matter, anthropology, sociology, they were limited. Today, not so much at Princeton, with the Eastern Studies program, but in almost all good history programs in the United States, Middle East history, Arab history, Turkish history, whatever, are part of the general program. Indeed, when you went to Binghamton, in Binghamton, it's the same thing. You were part of the history department teaching Arab history, but I'm trying to get in the reception of your work is increasing because it's now conceptually possible to think of Ottoman history as part of human history. This is the fundamental change, I think, why this happened, how this happened, what kind of works do we get at the end because of this closer contact between historians who specialize in different parts of the world working together in the same places, something we have to sort of pay attention to. And in that regard, the inclusion of Ottomans, let me put it from the end, in your work, because from the beginning, you look at Ottoman history as part of normal history. It resonates now better than it did, say, 2 generations, take even 1 generation ago. I think that's the answer to your question. But for that matter, we still don't do it. In Turkish universities, we still study history very parochially. It's like our history, Turkish history. Even Arabs don't matter. They're all Iranians, don't matter. In that sense, this parochialism is far more orientalistic than a good history program in the United States has become. It wasn't like this. But this receptivity to your books is directly related to, then I take my hat off to you for that. From the beginning, you looked at Ottoman history as part of normal human history. I think it's the difference.
I like your approach, but I see it differently. The way I see knowledge changing, social science and even the sciences, when there's change in understanding, in paradigms, it happens. It's really independent of me. This, I'm saying it's independent of me. In a way, I am a product of a different trajectory from what Ottoman historians, current and the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. And that current is what I am trying to blame or point to as the explanation for the reception. I don't think the reception is because of any profundity. I really think it's a reception for usefulness. it's a resting place to get out of the paradigm of decline. And the decline paradigm has become bankrupt worldwide. So it's not just local between, on the level of Ottoman history and Middle East history. So it ceases to be useful. And I think the issues are very profound, because I'm thinking, why would you invent, because we're talking about these are inventions. Mine is also an invention. All of these are inventions. Why would you, and when was the paradigm of decline produced? If you look at European relations with the Ottomans in the 16th and 17th century, there was no sense of superiority on the European part. So this question of the paradigm of decline comes with the rise of the West and the rise of power. So the decline paradigm is fallacious, okay? This is what we agree now. The question is, how did Europe and America actually invent, and why did it invent it, and when did it invent it, and how was it able to dominate knowledge about the history of the Middle East? Because you and I have had contacts with the modernization paradigm. I mean, Thomas and Itzkowitz are part of that. And again, there's a short discussion of it. It's not valid. It's an expression of power, and it's an investment. It's how they can actually justify this outlook on another human society as non-living, dead. For what reason? It's very political. It's justifying control. It's very much part of the people who educated me in modern Middle Eastern history were participants in that. And when I say Thomas and Itzkowitz had insights about this period, and I have to interpret, if they had these insights, why didn't they pursue them? I find that their insights actually were very creative, all right? And I'm looking at it, okay, now my work, I realize actually some of it. And I'm more interested now in why is my work at this time being accepted? It wasn't my goal to make my paradigms, if you want to really call them paradigms, different interpretations. Why is it being received by Ottoman historians in the last 20 years? And some of you are right here. And so I want you to share with me if you feel that there was a paradigm change, and do you try to, do you think that there's any reasonableness to see that perhaps the only real use of what I provided is not profound, it's a transitional period. I expect that in 20 years, I'm going to be forgotten, I'll be very happy to be forgotten, and a new interpretation is going to take place, all right? Because in a way, what I'm proposing is too simplistic. Ottoman society and our society was much more complex. We are reducing it to power, reducing it to politics. And I focused on politics because this is where the focus of an interpretation of Ottoman history that I received focused on. Okay, so this is, okay, so I'm engaging it. And I was finding that as I study the same period, it doesn't work, it doesn't explain, because I am starting with a living society. As I looked at it from the very beginning, some people said to me, and a couple of people responded actually to my dissertation, which was actually about the Ottoman defeat, right? Karlovitz, 1699 to 17 something. But only 2 people, since I published, not published it, but finished it in 63 and published some of it. One historian at Michigan, when I was being interviewed, was incidentally, he was Polish-American, was born in Poland, and he said, people told me, he thought it was a very sympathetic treatment, and a graduate student in art history, who basically was not my student, but I became her advisor. You know, maybe in her 30s right now. And she said, yes, I found it very sympathetic. And then I look back and say, what do you mean by sympathetic? I was really treating it as a human subject. I was treating them as equal people. And when you are victorious, you try to dictate, and they didn't dictate to the Ottomans in 1699. And I gather from a colleague who's working now on diplomacy in the 17th century that there was an occasion in which the Ottomans were defeated, and the basis for peace was supposed to be that the Austrians can dictate to the Ottomans which part of their territory they had to concede to Austria, right? Okay. So now I understand actually what I did in 63, right? And then again, the question of receptivity. Why is there this receptivity? And I still go back. And I think if I understand modern science, and I mean modern science in every aspect, that we obviously need a different interpretation, and my work represents a transition. And I don't expect it to be relevant in 20 years. And that's a different approach from what you're giving. Tell me, right? Yeah.
If you come back to your, in this sefer or intimate journey that you call it as a sefer, you have those that you have encountered as you directed them questions and they answered or they ignored it. Then there are those that who may be walking with you in the same couloir, and we have mentioned about Mukherjee. There's also another person here, Arif Dirlik, and I would add also Peter Gran, and then where would you put them in relations to your struggle? And then did you have any personal relations also as academic friends or whatever? No.
Arif Dirlik and I really became friends. We're not scholars who discovered ourselves as thinkers or anything. We were at conferences and we met, right. And my interpretation for Arif is different from Peter Grant. Again, Arif Dirlik, I would say we come from the same culture. We actually approach our societies as living societies. And Arif Dirlik looks at Chinese history as a living history also.
Right.
And so his struggle also with his work was to overcome this approach to China, as an inferior one. In a way to understand it, he also understands it not only scientifically for now, but critically also. He's much more critical about what's going on in China. I won't dare involve myself in this because I don't know it. He knows it. So I think I find my sympathy in terms of we have the same world outlook. Okay? And yeah.
How about Peter Grant? You said you would put it in different.
Peter Grant again. Yeah,
you
go ahead.
advised me to read him, and we discussed him, and
What I look at and Peter Grant, and as I look at him now, and of course this is something that I haven't shared with him because it'll be hard to. My approach is different from his. I think he approaches Arab history, Middle Eastern history, more by cultural production.
Right.
And I see my approach as looking at sources to explain the cultural production. So I see him, and the sympathies and empathies is his openness to the validity of the intellectual product for the time. In other words, his main work focuses on the what was called the decline period, but he showed that they were brilliant thinkers. Okay.
That's where the sympathy lies.
His ability to be a Westerner and actually to
be able to see that.
His assumptions that guided him, and I didn't affect them. He came with them. Where did he come from them? I don't know. But for me, it was lucky that he did, because then we can have it.
I would say Allah guided.
Okay, yes. Yeah. Or Allahu A'lam.
Allahu A'lam, and that's a better word.
For me, anyway.
Yes. And you said yesterday you love most this word, Allahu A'lam. You are very, I mean, from the the way that.
But I think this discussion shows
that absolutely. Yes.
I'm not saying I know. I am proposing.
Right.
And I can still propose, but it's not dogma.
I mean,
so when I say Allahu A'lam, it means that in the future somebody will revise it, and I'm not regretful that others are going to revise, because then they prove that they continue to be a living society and a creative society.
You have taught us a lot in our graduate studies about the agency. And you were sometimes even very nervous, like what you deny, why you deny your own choice. You did choose it, things like that. But now I'm not. My impression seems like when you are said that you have affected, you're saying no, I'm not. I didn't affect. I'm not. Just you're pulling back.
No, I mean the way I see what you're pointing out, I would say. First of all, in my approach, if somebody says I'm in Ottoman history and they don't know Ottoman language, I can't take them seriously. Okay?
We sympathize with that.
Yeah. In other words, you claim to be an expert, and I mean all of you who are doing Ottoman history, as far as I'm concerned, if you don't know Ottoman history, I will not be able to read your work because I don't know what you're going to contribute. And I don't care how brilliant you might be, because this is how I understand how you do history. Now, there are a lot of people who see history mainly as an intellectual thing, and they focus on theory and not try to understand it through theory. And for me, even if you are trying to understand it through theory, how are you going to prove? If you say I'm an expert, to me it's even worse than saying an expert in the 17th century, 18th century. I would say, go as far as saying, that anybody who does Ottoman history in the 19th and 20th century and doesn't know the previous 2 centuries, I don't know how you understand the history you're doing. Because you're actually saying, we are creating it from nothing, as if there's no context, as if the 200 or 300 years of Ottoman history, 300 years of that history, has no meaning for the 19th century, let alone understanding and how you interpret it. And I will give you a couple of examples that might surprise you, but maybe also be revelatory. I've done a lot of art history. My wife was an art historian, so she had no graduate degrees. We married, and she went on with a graduate degree together, and she did. And so I also learned art history and approaches, the approaches to art history. And she was sympathetic to the historical interpretation of history, the production of art as part of historical, of social processes. Anyway, the example I'm going to give, a graduate student, again in art history at Binghamton, an architect, a Turkish historian, wrote a review in the primary art history journal in the United States, the College Art Association journal. And he wrote a review critiquing a contemporary Iranian specialist who is, again, in this case, was obviously trained in the West, and she teaches at Yale now. Rizvi, I think is her name. Again, the Batuman was at Binghamton, his name was Batuman. He, I would say, he didn't take courses with me. He actually helped invent a course with me at history. I tried to explore teaching history from below. I proposed to create a course, and a couple of brilliant Turkish students like Batuman and Attila came in this course. Not because they were taking it because they needed to, they were intrigued, and they were more versed in it than I was, so, which is typical of us educators. We are educated by our students every time we are with them. And this is, for me, the most gratifying feature of teaching. If we don't grow with our students, I don't know what we are. I think it would be very boring anyway. Okay. So anyway, let's get to the illustration I'm trying to make. And just the background is important because I'm not talking about very important people ordinary like me, and we're trying to contend with knowledge and how do you understand. But my point is the arrogant statement on my part that if you don't know the previous couple of centuries to the 19th and 20th century, I don't understand how you could do 19th and 20th century. So I read his review of Rizvi's book. I bought both his book and her book, and they touch on the same issue. They're both dealing with modern Republic of Iran and Turkish Republic, and their investment in other Islamic countries by building mosques and building Muslim educational institutions. I read and benefited from the review, and I read the part of Batuman's book. And my students remain colleagues, and I continue to have a dialogue with them. I try anyway. So I wrote him, and I said, I read your review, I have your book, and I have a problem. You're looking at the investment that the Turkish Republic is making in other Islamic societies of mosques and religious institutions. And similarly, with the Saudi government, the Iranian scholar Rizvi was working with, again, another nation state, a modern nation state. We're really talking about contemporary states, all right? And this is, again, I'm trying to figure out. There's no context. I was trying to say, why would Saudi Arabia first initiate this? And even more profoundly, why would other Muslim countries accept these institutions? And the interpretation they both focus on is a nation state, right? Saudi Arabia is being a nation state, is expressing itself. And the thing that really puzzles me is not one attempt to address, let alone be aware of an explanation. Why would there be a reception? I mean, I want you to think, why would Lebanon, for example, where the Saudis invest in mosques, and in the case of Turkey, or other Muslim countries, accept?
Because they are Muslim.
For you, it's very obvious, right?
Yes, it's very obvious.
That's
right?
new. But you said to me, yeah, it's interesting. Now, I'm sharing it with you. I haven't pursued it further, but maybe this is as far as I will go in pursuing it. At least he said, and he didn't say it right away. This is all incidentally by email. I mean, we're not talking about meeting each other or knowing each other. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. So, but my contact and my engagement, I'm reading this review that basically I see as a colleague is writing. And I am puzzled. Why do you leave that? And what does it mean? It obviously was not part of their worldview. They didn't see, I have to say, that the connection is some kind of cultural coexistence, acceptance. This is the receptivity, to me, is actually more important than the initiatives of these nation states. Because the others are receiving it and not saying, you're aliens, why would you want to invest? They actually are welcoming it and they're adopting it and using it. So from my point of view, I look at those of you who are working in the 19th and 20th century and say it's irrelevant, this 17th, 18th century, and probably don't think of it in terms of culture. What is this culture that produced the 19th, 20th century that you're studying? And are you aware that it has any significance in the period you're studying, let alone into the projections of how we are going to look at the future? What means are we going to look at the future? And one approach, and I feel that my engagement in the work I've done, as I said, remember, 35 years only of engagement in primary work on Ottoman history. I see, the European Union as an exemplar in that sense. In the case of Batumi and Rizvi, they're focusing on the nation states. And Europe is abandoning the nation states. And it's interesting for those of you who keep up with what's going on in Europe. What is the basis of what unites the European Union. It's no more the nation state. Some kind of common culture. And the way it's appearing, again, some of you who keep up with Eastern Europe, the reception or rejection of Muslim refugees in Poland and Hungary is based on what? They're Muslims, we're Christians. This is, again, we're talking about 2018, I'm not talking about 1920. They're basically using what they identify as their culture. I'm not saying it's valid, but I'm talking about, at least they use it as an excuse to reject.
Yes, sure. Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be a little intrusive, and I do apologize for that. So throughout me listening to you, I've heard you make statements like unconscious memory, rebellion, being part of a larger culture, memory and emotion, a history of a living society. If I were to accuse you, and if I'm going to play devil's advocate...
No, go ahead, accuse me anything you want to. I have a big ego, I can take it.
Well, I appreciate that then.
Because I trust you, okay?
Thank you very much. If one was to accuse academics who were talking about a lived experience in which they can understand the Ottoman past, or even the greater Muslim world, from a perspective which is a lived experience which resonates discursively, in which they can look at the past and say, hang on a minute, this makes sense to me because I belong to something that I've lived. And so
lived? You lived, you say?
Well,
yeah, go ahead. No,
this is one of the things that we argue.
Understand
right?
what you said.
Yeah, so one of the arguments is in the Western context, there's a disconnect. I'm from England, for example, and one could be accused.
No, I understand now. Yeah, okay.
So in that context, to what degree is then history an intellectual endeavor instead of an emotional endeavor? In the sense that what we're actually arguing here is from a perspective of emotion, and so one could be accused, because you talk about rejection, which was really interesting for me in that context. You didn't remember the question, you remembered the rejection, which is something...
Good, no, right? I'm glad. Yeah, no, you go ahead.
And this is the commonality we have in this part of the world.
Okay.
The issue of legitimacy, the issue of who has the legitimacy, the continual rejection by scholars in this part of the world, and not being listened to and not being heard to. And so I'm asking you the question then, could you be accused, rather than being an academic who's intellectual, rather than an academic who's constructed an emotion within his work, which is not as important as the way Western academics view it?
Brilliant, good. Okay. What are you doing by making these statements? What you're actually denying my humanity, my ability to be emotional. And what am I being emotional about? I don't think I'm being emotional about something irrational here. I'm discovering these things. I remember for 50 years I took what really was a rejection of where my questions were coming from. I took it, as basically a misunderstanding. They just didn't understand. But I have now, the end of my life, I've really tried to contend with this. And the rejection I see here is first the assumptions behind. First of all, the questions they ask about the society that I belong to, the values, the religion, the culture, are based on a non-living society. In other words, when they look at their own history, they don't see it as dead. They see it as living. Now, I am not contending I'm right in anything. all I am emotional about is really the rejection of my humanity. Now I'm discovering that they're saying your culture is for shit, and I can really ignore you. And in fact, that guy who said, I don't want to insult you, and a graduate student, I am already a professor with a Princeton PhD, you couldn't get any more education. And a graduate student could say to you, I don't want to insult you. Contempt behind that. Okay. I want to confront you in a different angle. As I look at my life, what I feel now, and I'm saying feel because I'm aware of that what I basically discovered is I discovered my culture. And what it means to me, okay? And when somebody basically says to me, by implication, that your history is irrelevant. Here you are, you're equal scholars, and instead of answering me, they said, they criticized me, and this guy says, I don't want to insult you. In other words, he couldn't deign to discuss with me the issues that he was raising. And I'm talking about 60 years of it. I'm not talking about 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 incidents. And it was consistent. So I have to use my training to try to explain this phenomenon. I'm not saying that what I am proposing is the truth. I'm proposing a different way of getting out, of denigrating a living society that actually contended with the political dimension, if you want to think about Ottoman society in the 17th and 18th century. And here it is. It's a rational discussion, all right? And incidentally, it's very interesting. Even the reception of my work now in the West, among Ottoman historians, is always tepid, always saying, oh, by the way, he may have suggested something. And what is fascinating for me, and again it's something I'm discovering recently, that they are more readily accepting, Westerners are more readily accepting Israeli interpretation of Middle Eastern history. I haven't probed it, and I don't have the equipment to probe it. I don't know Israeli society. So I look at interpretations of this kind as part of the heritage. This is where these interpretations are made in this social context. So what I'm asking is, what are the commonalities of assumptions? Yeah, right.
So this is what I find interesting. Now, for those of us, because you spend most of your time in the US, but for those of us here, who are living in this part of the world, in a way we're engaging with the academia. So I'm going to keep pulling from your mind so that we can take as much as we can.
Ahead. I'm ready.
So the construction of the state of Israel is the only state that doesn't have an Ottoman past, right? That's fair enough to say in terms of when we look at the countries that have come from the Ottoman past. They have an investment of the Ottoman past. They have a history, a memory of the Ottoman past. I've always made this case quite openly that Palestinian identity shouldn't be in opposition to the Israeli identity because they have a past that goes beyond the Israeli state. And here you just mentioned that Israeli academics in particular have found a sense of agency about writing about the Ottoman past, monopolizing a particular narrative over academics in the region who are unable or unwilling to do so. How does one in this region then challenge that?
Well, I don't think you're answering the question and the problematic I was posing. First of all, I make no judgment about Israeli scholarship because I don't know it, and I don't know Israel. So I don't know the dynamics for the production of that knowledge. I'm just pointing out the phenomenon. There is more receptivity to Israeli scholarship about the same phenomenon that I'm dealing with, Ottoman history. So you have to, if you remain rational and equal, you'll have to say, okay, Israeli society is normal, right? It's producing knowledge, and that knowledge obviously reflects the interests of Israel and its interpretation of its place in the Middle East. In a way, I can say they are intruders, they have no business. If you want me to be emotional, I'll say they have no business doing Ottoman history, okay? Because they didn't exist. So from where, how would they justify, unless you accept the fact that the Israelis are more scientific than we can be, that they can actually transcend human nature and be scientific beyond a social heritage. Do you see my...
No, I understand your point here.
Let me ask you things that will bring you to more calm and calm.
I'm very happy.
And then still emotional.
Don't you know,
Still emotional.
I mean, they accuse me of being emotional, no. And I see myself as being human.
Yes, you know, there's a part of our human history is our family. You know,
of course.
One of the things is, you know, you pay a lot of attention to your mother, and then I had a question related to that one. Maybe later on I will ask you. But now one of the questions is here. Your relations with your girls seems wonderful. Your relations with your, you know, Sarah and Ida, you know, your girls seems wonderful. How was your family life? That's a question here. How would you tell us about this? In fact, your...
No. I have nothing.
This public.
In this sense, I have nothing to hide.
Your daughter today told me that our father used to tell us that he's known, and we used to, as a family, used to think about that as just, you know, he's our father, he's just telling us this. But they say to me today, when we came to Turkey, we saw in hotel that there are like hundreds of people are calling you, hundreds of people are trying to reach you. And we go everywhere, and you are all known very much, you are very much connected. They said, we now witness that he is really famous. That's their comment on your this experience, current experience. So tell us about your experience with them.
First of all, let me respond to what you just said. And you have to take it seriously, if you think that I devoted my life to doing Ottoman history because I want to be famous, no, but that's the implication. My daughters are recipients of the most recent experiences. My daughters don't know my scholarship. They know me as a father, and hopefully as a normal father. Okay, so again, you're using this contemporary scene, and as I said to you, I am surprised at the reception.
Yes.
Okay. And it's not my goal. I don't seek fame. Okay.
We believe in that one.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So
what is the question?
Question is that your relations to your daughters as a father and family member. Now, after knowing this, your relations, how you would evaluate it?
Them and what they're seeing.
Yeah, what they have seen.
Well,
Yes.
again, if you want to be that intimate, I'm willing to be intimate. First of all, the way I raise, my wife and I raise our children is completely secular. Secular. No, I'm just pointing out to you.
You know.
And we raise them basically free time, you know, you're free. And we violated all kinds of traditions in terms of raising them. Because you're talking about my raising my children.
Right.
And basically, both of my daughters in the last couple of months, called me and said, I have this question, this issue. One of my daughters is a therapist at a university in Canada, and another university in Canada is inviting her to become a therapist there. one condition this new place is asking, would you identify yourself as an ethnic minority? All right, her name is Abou-El-Haj.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and she's white, obviously, and so on. And they will not accept her application unless she is to declare that she is a minority, because they need somebody in the therapy department.
Right.
Because there are a lot of foreign students who are there and alienated students. So. And she posed that question to me and she said, what do I do? I said, look, I raised you independent. You are 45 years old. You have to answer. Tell me, right? I mean, we raise our children to be adults. We hope they will be autonomous enough to be able to make their own decisions. And I tell them, I am behind you whatever decision you make.
Yes.
Even when you make the wrong decision, I'm still behind you.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
So
what
that's
we
my
wanted.
answer to you.
Yeah, that was like, how is your relation with your family? There's a question continues with Barbara Abou-El-Haj, how they have affected and been affected from your academic venture. How they have been affected with your academic venture or not? That's a question there. Your academic things, how they did see that?
I think maybe this looks like a very trivial question, but I think it's a very profound question. Because it's really asking you, what is your worldview? Yeah, because that's the implication.
Yunus Hoja is the one who wrote this
What?
question.
No, no.
Yunus Hoja is here. He's the one who wrote the question,
okay.
and you can even clarify.
I'll respond, and I'll try to respond to you because we know each other and we trust each other. I trust you anyway, so.
Yes, he trusts you also.
And I feel comfortable answering you because, as I said, none of the questions you've raised, I feel uncomfortable. I feel actually comfortable to answer you in the best way I can. Do you want let him answer question or
You answer then after that. Okay, he's answering your question. Yes, you answer it. He's in the process.
I don't make a distinction between my scholarship and who I am. And you know, when you comment about my being emotional, yes, well, what's wrong with being emotional? What's wrong with being passionate about knowledge, the creation of knowledge, engagement, and especially when that really challenges your existence, your being, your validity as a human being. And I feel my education has helped me, and I answer your question about you being in Britain, and I would want to interrogate you about that also, and answering to that. I feel first that a lot of us here, and maybe some of you may not be aware of it, we are very special in being at least bilingual, okay? Which means we are bicultural. What does that mean? What does bicultural mean? How do you, being bicultural, give you a different view from a monocultural person? And so I feel that by realizing that by being monocultural, by being bicultural, it has actually allowed me to see European, American society as equal to my own, because I regard my own culture and my history as valid, equally valid. So it actually helps me to be empathetic with the others, with other societies. And I do not dehumanize them. Because I think the approach that Europeans and Americans have taken to Ottoman history and Middle Eastern history, it dehumanizes. When they say we don't belong to a living society, when they impose the kind of interpretation, we have to understand our own history with. I'm going to be emotional about it because they're denying my culture. They're denying my existence, the relevance of my existence. And I'm going to be emotional about that.
I'm sorry if it's irrelevant, but if we get back to the Ottoman studies in Israel, could you please explain us in what ways do the Ottoman studies in Israel serve the interests of the Israeli state? Something that we couldn't sort out, identify. Thank you.
I mean, I already disclaimed an ability to evaluate. All I'm proposing is that as a historian, and I think we all do that, when a society produces knowledge, and especially when they're producing knowledge about another society, but any knowledge, it will reflect its own reality. So if I were to do a research on the framework to understand Israeli scholarship about the Ottoman Empire, and as our friend here already said, Israel didn't exist, okay? So I'm happy, here I'm really creating a false impression because I'm only using my imagination, and if I were to do a research program on it, I will have to figure out what are the questions I want to ask. Along with the question you said, Israel, if you really seriously believe, I'm not saying that, you're the one who's saying it. Israel does not have anything to do with Ottoman history. Because, again, and remember, I'm not saying that. You are the ones who are using these assumptions, and you're accepting them. Then you have to ask. The first question, if there's a relevance between the contemporary Israeli society and its outlook on the world, and doing research in Ottoman history, especially in the period when Israel did not exist. So it's not an issue of the notion of Israel existing in the 19th century. It didn't exist. There was no Palestine any time, okay? There were provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and we know where they are. So you have to ask, then, what's the connection? Does it have, and these are questions I'm asking. I can't honestly do the research in them to get at least answers that I can find credible for myself. If our research programs, our science and outlook, are determined by who we are at the moment, because who are at the moment means we are the inventors of the meaning at this point. So there is relevance. And Israeli scholars are claiming that because they live in the Middle East, they can actually talk about the Ottoman Empire, and maybe even more objectively than me or any inhabitant or intellectuals of the Middle East or Arab Islamic society. And this is, again, I'm putting on the negative side of it. I mean, it's puzzling for me if, in fact, modern Israeli scholarship relates to the history of Israel. There is no history there. So you're going to have to say, what is the current use? And the way I would say is that it's a way of appropriating an interpretation which I find interesting that Europeans and Americans find credible, interesting. I actually don't read Israeli scholarship because, again, if I were to read it, I would have to understand it in terms of its local production. Why is it being produced? I was asked in one of the several times in the conferences I attended here in the last week, I think a fantastic question. Somebody said, what do you think, what I think of modern Turkish scholarship on Ottoman history? And I have to answer you. If I were to answer that question, I'll be dishonest and pretentious. I don't know contemporary Turkish history. And if contemporary Turkish scholarship on the Ottoman Empire has relevance to this society, and I assume it does, and as it should, I'm not saying it shouldn't, because there is no such thing as an objectivity. So I can't honestly answer. But the suggestion here is that perhaps there are certain assumptions behind Israeli scholarship and Western scholarship that coincide and find more receptivity than my scholarship in America by my colleagues. I'm not talking about people I don't know who don't know me. They are people I meet in conferences. Okay. So it's very real. It's existential. It's not flippant. You're not saying I can do this. No. It's existential. You're there. I mean, did I answer? Yeah. Okay.
We will be trying to end it here. But as the last question, maybe you get a very short answer to it. You are speaking to us this last 1 week. You are rediscovering. You are finding yourself. That's what we are hearing a lot. Since this is an autobiography and it will stay for the archives of this institution, it won't be publicized from here. I would just to see what would be your answer to the question. What would you, if you wanna say this process of your rediscovering yourself, if you wanna say it in one word, what would you say? Would you say it's a rebirth? Would you say it is conversion? Would you say it is, I'm just like,
No, I completely understand what you're saying.
In what would you use to catch it in one word? This is process, I know.
One word would be too simplistic.
Simplistic.
To answer, but I already have an answer for you.
Okay, great.
As you're saying, I'm formulating the answer. First of all, why am I doing this history? And I'm answering, it's discovering who I am. Okay?
Yes.
So that's the first step. And who am I, and what conclusion have I arrived at? I find that the more honest and emotionally acceptable answer to myself, is not the scientific answer. If history is a science, then Ottoman history should be considered objectively. What I have discovered is that I belong to this culture that produced Ottoman history and continues to produce Middle Eastern history. And what I'm hoping, and this is my aspiration, which is your topic, okay, is that we who belong to this culture can come to understand that we have these commonalities, and in terms of looking at our future, how do we, especially as intellectuals, try to understand where should we go? If Europe can actually do what it is doing, why can't we do it? And I also see it as inevitable. The nation state is false. It's false for Europe. It's even more false for us. Because the nation state is based on, to me, the most abhorrent assumption. There is such a thing as a race, an Arab race. an Indian race. All right? And so, I think it's abhorrent to the culture that I cherish. And this is basically what I'm discovering. I'm discovering that really my culture is very valid. And my work in history, everybody might read it as fantastic or so, but for me it really affirms that, yeah, I'm valid, and guess what? I'm the happiest in my life at this stage, as I accept this. And I want to just add that the reception I've received here confirms that for me. I mean, everywhere, at every level, from the hotel, restaurants, and more profoundly by the audiences that have been really profound in the kinds of questions that they raised, and challenging, but I would say I'm happy to be able to at least attempt an answer. But I'm telling you, I'm happy, the happiest I've ever been in my life. I know myself. And if that is not the reason for existence, then I don't know what is.
We are all belonging to this culture.
Teşekkür ederim. Can you use, because I don't hear very well. So.
Thank you. I came a little bit late,
That's
so
okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the speech. You brought quite a lot of interesting topics. As someone that actually discusses with Jakob a lot regarding the nation state, and someone who's studying history, PhD, but also working in Turkey, but also raised in the UK, one of the interesting questions, as someone who also comes from the Balkans, is this idea of the EU moving beyond the nation state. And it's a very interesting subject for me, because in the Balkans, where you have one of the largest concentrations of Muslims in Europe, who go back centuries.
Who are natives.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is important to point out. They're natives.
Yeah.
Didn't come from the outside. They are products of these societies.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And the difficulty is that many of them are aspiring to join the EU. And it's something that makes me nervous. It's something that I feel a little bit emotional about, actually. Because if many of these countries join, they are very likely to be consumed by the ideas inside the EU. And they will very likely lose their Islam. And we cannot assume that Islam belongs to anyone. And just like the Spanish before, who after 800 years there is nothing there, Islam in the Balkans has only been for 500 years as opposed to the 800 years that it was in Spain. And I guess my question is, are there any... So the contradiction partially is that sometimes I think if they join the EU, you'll lose this, and therefore they have to maintain a particular nation-state model, not because I agree with it, it just seems like a barrier against what's about to happen, which is something much, much worse, which is sometimes why I find it bizarre that Turkey actually wants to join the EU. And are there any mechanisms of resistance that we should be employing to try and think beyond the EU, but also beyond the nation state in the Balkans, but also taking into account that actually we don't really, there is no alternative model at the moment. And if you can't join the EU, then you'll be stuck with a degrading nation-state model, and you can't join anything else. I mean, are there any mechanisms to try and deal with this, in your opinion? Have you given thought to that aspect as well?
There are many ways to answer you, okay? You're assuming that, and this is a contingency, that the Southeastern European entities, whatever you want to call them, aspire to become part of the European Union. Right? You see this as an attempt to threaten, right? Threaten the Muslims in these regions. Okay. Now, there are several ways of looking at it. One, if you want to look at these Muslims who want to be part of Europe, they can actually teach Europe a lesson. Because the model of Islamic culture in Spain and more close, they are actually examples that are part of that model. If you look at at Ottoman history and culture before 1800, and everybody seems to forget, actually, the incredible human experiment in which in Ottoman culture, all entities, irrespective of religion, language, and values, were participants. So when you say Ottoman culture before 1800, you're including Armenians, Greeks, and so on. So, and they were accepted. They're not. I mean, accepted is looking down on them as if they're outside. They're accepted as equal entities that create that history. So that experiment before 1800, in which those who are not Muslim actually created a common culture, and not by coercion or by reluctance, by almost a nature of the assumptions of that culture. So, I mean, a lot of people use Andalusian Spain as an example, but I think the Ottoman Empire before 1800 is a closer example of that phenomenon. Okay. So I'm just giving you just to think on it. I don't have an answer because history is messy, right? And it doesn't follow what we wish. All I can answer are possibilities. Okay. So, in that possibility, if Europe is willing to do what the Ottoman Empire did before 1800 and say, yes, we will welcome you as equal partners of that culture, and I'm not saying they're going to, and again you're putting conditions, and I'm saying, okay, you created a messy situation, I'm giving you a possible answer there. Or I'm going to take even a more flagrant counter-example to you. There's an Ottoman Greek scholar on the island of Crete. And I don't know him, but I know his work. And so I corresponded with him. This is how I know the Ottoman field. I don't know people necessarily personally. I correspond. And he's Greek. And I read some of his work. And from his scholarship, I find some discomfort, the kind of scholarship he does. So I'm not going to go into detail. If you want to, I can. But so I posed the question to him. I said, you're Greek. Have you considered what Greeks, how have you considered that you might be a product of the Ottoman experience? And he was shaken by that. He said, I'll answer you later. He never answered. So at least in his own mind, somebody is raising this question. And again, if you know what's going on in Greece, I'm just going to go and be arrogant and say that the discomfort of Greece in being in the European Union, I see it as a discomfort based on the fact that it actually was a part of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. It's not for 10 years, 20 years. I know, presumably, it was the beginning of the 19th century. There was the Greek nation and so on and so forth. Okay. So that's one. And the other, I would say, maybe if there is a union that actually connects this culture that I'm talking about, that actually the Muslims in Southern Europe might opt to join that. That actually it might be more amenable for them. Abandoning again the nation state. Because that's going to be their salvation, no matter what. The nation state is not going to be their solution. Again, I may not have answered your question. I'm giving you some possibility.
Thank you very much. This is really, from the bottom of our heart, we would say, Jazakallahu khair al-jaza.
Astaghfirullah. Thank you.